Hi, everybody. I am very excited to be here today with Charlotte Meyer. Charlotte is a friend, and I'm very proud to call her a friend of mine. She is an author. Congratulations, Charlotte. She's a former attorney, a mother, a stepmother, and a widow. So, Charlotte has a very, very powerful story to share with us. And I'm really excited because you have literally just published your amazing memoir, Sushi Tuesdays, which I've read at a rapid rate. So, Charlotte, welcome to the Conscious Grief series.
Thank you, Tara. Thanks so much for having me. I'm very grateful for the work that you do and thrilled to be chatting with you today.
So am I. So am I. And yeah, just again, really congratulations on your book. I have cried multiple times today and redone my mascara multiple times, but equally have laughed in equal measure. And as the book says, it's a memoir of love, loss, and family resilience. And you really are such a resilient character. So perhaps you'd like to share with the audience to begin with, about yourself and a little bit more about the story of Sushi Tuesdays.
Thank you so much. I am just absolutely thrilled that you loved it. It's definitely been a passion project for the last 10 years, a little longer actually. And so it's very thrilling to see it out in the world and in hands. I still kind of can't believe it. This is not the book I ever expected I would write with my life. I was widowed in 2007, and my children at the time were 6 and 8 years old, and I had no idea that Sam was suffering so much. I didn't know. And so to process his loss, his suicide, and to parent grieving children through that was never an experience I had anticipated having. And part of why I decided that I would write the book, sometimes I feel like the book was demanding to be written because there's so much silence around suicide. There's so much stigma and shame that it was important to me to give a particular voice to suicide loss. Stigma and shame can reduce a person's life to their very last act. And not only is that unfair, it's an inaccurate understanding of suicide. So that was why I just had to write the book. I tried not to, but it wouldn't let me. It just was demanding to be shared.
And you tell this story with such insight and wisdom, because nobody knows how they're going to, react in such a situation. And in a way, the story is sort of about you, trying to understand why Sam would kill himself. And when we talked beforehand, you talked about how, suicide is a particularly thorny grief to have to deal with, and how it has its own shade of guilt. So I'm sure a lot of people who have, experienced a suicide loss can relate to that. Would you be opening to sharing a bit more on that?
Absolutely. In our case, Sam's suicide was very sudden. That's not always the case for suicide loss. We had no idea. I had no idea. And Sam didn't talk about it. He wasn't in therapy. He wasn't on medication. He hadn't been diagnosed with depression or bipolar or schizophrenia. He had back pain, which a lot of people do. He had job stress, which if you have a job, you have job stress. And if you don't have a job, then you really have job stress. But suicide is a particularly thorny death to try to unravel. And I don't say that in a better or worse sort of dynamic. I don't think that any grief is better or worse than any other. It all sucks in its own unique way. And the way in which suicide is particularly thorny is that the person that you are grieving and the person you love and you've lost is also the person whose actions have killed them. And it is complicated. There's a lot of guilt. There's a lot of feelings of abandonment. Suicide looks on the surface like a choice. I don't believe that it's a conscious choice. I believe that suicide is an illness, and that illness is what took Sam away, just like a sudden heart attack or an undiagnosed cancer or a diagnosed cancer. It just really looks ugly from the outside. And that can be a very difficult process to heal from.
Yeah. And I know that you said that, you really feel that you're on this mission in destigmatizing talking about suicide. Maybe also for some people who don't know about that, we so often phrase it as committed suicide. Perhaps you'd like to share with the viewers why that's not appropriate.
How we talk about suicide matters. Language makes a difference. And so the phrase commit suicide has connotations, criminal connotations. And suicide, while it had at some point in our histories been qualified as a crime, suicide is not a crime. And so that's why it's important that we understand how it works. So even in just using the phrase commit suicide, it feels judgmental and terrible. So we use phrases like killed himself or died by suicide, or even suicided as a verb, which sounds weird to say. For example, Sam suicided. It's not what our ears are accustomed to, but that just takes practice. And as we become aware of it, when we use the term died by suicide, is usually what I say most frequently, it takes some of that judgment out of it. And it's really important to take the judgment out when we're talking about suicide, because otherwise the stigma and the shame are just really stuck to the whole process. And it's not just that person who died, stigma and shame, although I believe that's part of the challenge, is how difficult it is to reach out for help when you're afraid of being shamed or stigmatized for your own, what I believe is an illness. But also for the ones of us who are left grieving, our grief is just as valid as anybody else's. Just because our loved one died in this way doesn't mean their life is worth any less. It doesn't mean they suffered any less. I had a big argument with one of my cousins once because another of our cousins died from cancer at a very young age. And my cousin had said to me, Carol was fighting for her life and Sam just threw his away. And I pushed back on that. I was very angry. I said, Sam didn't throw his life away. He was fighting just as hard as Carol was. The difference is he was fighting alone. He didn't have people offering to drive carpool. He didn't have therapy. He didn't have medication. He didn't have casseroles showing up on his doorstep. And that isolation, that aloneness adds to the difficulty, both for somebody suffering and for those of us grieving the loss of somebody who's died by suicide.
Yeah. And, while you were just talking then, it made me think about how, other people's reactions when somebody dies, full stop, is hard to deal with. And then particularly in the case of suicide. But what I did really feel from your book was that you had this incredible support system. And just the thank yous in the back of your book were just like really astounding, like the community that you had, and your stark contrast, I guess, from Sam, who found it impossible to ask for help, and you really did the opposite, and you really decided what you needed and what you didn't need. The other thing that really struck me was you have so much love for Sam, and yet you really portray the frustration and the anger as well, and that you really encouraged your boys to unleash their anger and just really own that. And I really love those scenes.
It is very hard to parent young children in the throes of grief. Americans, and I imagine Brits too, are particularly poor at grief. We're just not good at it. We'd rather be stoic. We'd rather go past it. And especially with children, you've suffered loss, great loss as a young person. And sometimes I think we forget that our children are people who are grieving in their own particular ways, and they need this support. So it's really important to me to find the language to work with the kids about feelings and grief. And part of that was saying yes to people who offered to help. When people said, "Can I do something for you?" I'd say yes. I didn't always know what that was. But that is part, that transparency and the vulnerability, in my opinion, is part of what really promotes healing. That's the conscious grief that you're talking about. Part of my work with my own therapist also was learning to hold my children's anger in a way that I felt safe and they could be safe. We used a lot of words that we call Uncle Jose's colorful words. We used a lot of Uncle Jose's colorful words in the wake of Sam's death. And for me, that was just, it was an easy way for the kids to express their anger. And we had some parameters around that. You can't use Uncle Jose's words to hurt each other, and you shouldn't use them at school because I can't save you from the principal. So you're safe at home, but maybe not use those words at school. And I think it was important for the kids to know sometimes little words are great expressions of big feelings, especially for little people. And they're just words. Mm-hmm. Words have great power, of course, but if you are using that power intentionally, then that's what they're for. Mm-hmm. So it was important to me to be able to have those really transparent conversations with the children. They were 6 and 8 when their father died. And little people are smart, and you can have these conversations. The conversation didn't stop when they were 6 and 8. We still have these conversations. They're 21 and 23 now. So there's a lot more nuance in our conversations. There's a lot bigger words. We still use Uncle Jose's colorful words, but the conversation doesn't end because the love doesn't end. But then we also need to move forward with our lives. So how do we hold both the love and embrace our life? Right.
Yeah. And like, there's so much of that, isn't there? Like holding opposites in grief. And I was thinking a bit about the 3 S's that you really have is suicide, self-care, and self-compassion. And, the reason why you called this book Sushi Tuesday. And I feel like you're such a creative person as well, because you sort of came up with this strategy for yourself that helped support your grief. So would you share about that?
Sure. I don't know how intentional it was. I feel like I noticed something that was starting to happen and then grabbed onto it. So right after Sam died, I had a favorite yoga class on Tuesday mornings. And then my therapist had a recurring spot open up in her schedule for Tuesday midday. And so then Tuesdays, I went to yoga, I went to therapy, and Tuesday started becoming a really sort of a sacred day. So from the time I dropped the kids off at school at 8 until about 2 o'clock, that was my time I had just for Charlotte on Tuesdays. And I started really protecting that time. I called it my Charlotte Shabbat. So I went to yoga, I went to therapy. I didn't make appointments with MDs, CPAs, BFDs. I didn't even make coffee dates with my girlfriends or or lunch. I didn't want to have the pressure of having to put on mascara or meet somebody at a certain time. So Tuesdays became my day that was just my self-care day. What does Charlotte need today? Some days Charlotte needed to crawl back in bed and cry, and that's okay. There was space for that. Some days I went for a walk. Some days I took myself out to lunch. The kids were little, so they didn't really like sushi. So that would be kind of a treat for me. And I didn't, like I say, I didn't meet someone else. I just went where I wanted to go. So my sushi, my Tuesdays became then my Sushi Tuesdays. And so when I started writing, that's what I called my blog. And then obviously the book, Sushi Tuesdays, really is about self-care, about self-compassion, letting myself off the hook for what I missed. It was easier to forgive Sam than it was to forgive myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you like to talk about that process of coming to forgive yourself?
Well, I had struggled with depression, not as some as an adult. I had postpartum depression. I suffered with depression when I was in high school. And Sam knew that I had suffered from depression. I had no idea that he was suffering. But because I had had this experience, I felt like I should have known. And I think if I had known, for example, that some of what the signs of suicidal ideation are, maybe I would have paid more attention. If I had been more fluent in the language of mental health and mental distress and suicidal ideation, maybe I have done something. Now, this can be a very toxic loop to get stuck into. The guilt then that I could have saved him, that it was my fault. And so I had to arrive at this place where I allowed myself to own the things that were mine to own. And then I gave to Sam the things that were his to own. And the mistake, in my opinion, that Sam made was not asking for help. We can't control necessarily what diseases come our way. And when you understand suicidal ideation is a disease, just like diabetes or cancer, there are some things we can do to protect ourselves, leading a healthy lifestyle. And also, sometimes we all suffer from different diseases that we didn't ask for, we didn't want. So the more we understand that that is the dynamic that's happening, what are we supposed to do with those things? And so where I landed with Sam was that it was his job to ask for help. And that's what he didn't do. And I will never really know, would it have made a difference? Would one more day have made a difference? If he had made it through that day, would he be here now? You can drive yourself crazy going down that path. Mm-hmm. So I let myself down that path a little bit. My therapist and I brought me back. For me, healing is a lifelong journey. And then there are some things that are very, very helpful. Meditation, yoga, therapy, being compassionate with myself, finding compassion for Sam, finding compassion for Charlotte. Those are all part of the process.
Thank you so much for sharing that. There's also this amazing wisdom that's shared with you early on after Sam dies from his uncle, was it? Or Kirk, from Kirk, whose father had also died by suicide. I would wonder if you'd be open to reading that, actually. Yeah. I think about 100 pages in.
Okay. Kirk was a friend of mine from college, and I had forgotten that his father had died by suicide when he and his brother were also young, I think 8 and 10. And so at one point I called Kirk. We talked for an hour. Kirk didn't sugarcoat. I saw my father in the coffin, he said. Still, for years, I had a nagging suspicion it was all fake. I would look for him in crowds and at airports. Kirk had suffered. He had made some regrettable decisions, but along the way, he had also gained perspective, compassion, and grit. I found his voice of experience comforting. You'll be amazed at what you and your boys can accomplish, he said. Toward the end of our conversation, he said something that has stayed with me ever since. Grief is like a heavy sandbag at your feet, he told me. And if you do not pick it up, it will trip you for the rest of your life. But when you do pick it up, you will notice there's a little tiny hole in the bag. That's where the grains of sand start to fall out. Kirk showed me what was possible for my boys. His was the encouragement I needed to hear. He didn't pretend that healing would happen quickly, but he assured me that each grain of sand falling, however imperceptibly, inevitably lightened the bag. When you do pick it up, he said, two things will start to happen. The sandbag will get lighter and you will get stronger.
Wow.
I loved that metaphor for grief because it's so true. If you ignore it, if you pretend it's not there, it will just get stuck in your feet and you will fall flat on your face. But I love that idea that when you pick it up, then there's a little hole.
Yeah, it is. It's really true. What an amazing man. And
good friend.
A really good friend to share that with you. I absolutely love that. And I was wondering also about your faith, because you were raised as a Christian Scientist, which is interesting to me because I also was raised in Christian Science church for half of my childhood. And then understandably, you kind of, it's quite interesting how you talk about your relationship with God and like being mad at God, and then you also referred to God as a she. And so I wondered if that was something you always had done, or that changed. How is your faith shaped since Sam's death?
That is such a great and big question. Right after Sam died, I was very angry with God. I've always had sort of a fluid understanding of God's, pronouns and qualities. So referring to God as she, did two things for me. One, some people find it insulting, and I was okay with that because I was really angry. And if I'm insulting your God, whatever. So people say weird things about God and faith after someone's died, and some things that in the context of suicide are particularly unhelpful. For example, this is all part of God's plan. Like, God planned this? I don't need that kind of God. A God who plans the death of a good and kind man, the father of young children? That made no sense to me. And it really made me angry. So I used to say I was not on speaking terms with God. And if she wanted to come to me, she could make a house call, but I was not going to darken her door. As it turns out, God is, if you have a concept of God, which I do, that's a pretty safe place to put your anger. In fact, probably one of the safer places to put anger. One of my dear friends invited me at about the 1-year anniversary of Sam's death. We call that anniversary Deathiversary. I think I've heard you say that too, because Deathiversary is sort of, it carries the gravity of that day. It's not exactly a celebration, even though we can track the progress we have made healing. So when Sam's first Deathiversary was coming, this friend of mine issued an invitation to go with her to church. And she issued it in such a way that I felt safe either saying yes or saying no. And as soon as she said, I've been thinking about something to honor Sam and you and the kids, and I'm wondering if you would want to come to church and brunch afterwards. And as soon as she said that, I realized I did want to go. And the minister who was speaking at her church that day was a big, tall Texan guy. He's a great speaker. And he was talking about Jacob wrestling with the angel. That's a story of Jacob going to return to his brother, who he has stolen the inheritance from, essentially. And so Jacob has this experience of wrestling with an angel. And the minister was talking about how much that struggle Jacob was having with the angel was similar to the minister's own struggle with God after the death of his 10-year-old child from cancer, and how very angry he was at God. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is a man who knows how much pain I'm in. And then the pastor said what he realized about Jacob and his wrestling, and the minister himself with his ranting and railing at God, that ranting and railing was holding a connection still with God. And what I realized sitting there in the seat is all these times I've been calling God names, all God hears is that Charlotte's calling. And that for me was a very tender moment. It was not unlike Charlotte holding her son's grief, that kind of divine that can hold the whole range of what I'm feeling and feel compassion for it, but not a God who planned it, like shaking up the ant farm kind of planning, but a God who is with me in the mess of it. That was a God now that I thought I could be friends with. So that was a big shift for me in my own internal faith and understanding of a divine power at play in all of what was happening in my life. Not a God who controls or plans or creates things or takes away things, but a God who suffers with us in the mess. And that was a big shift for me.
Mm. And what about the pronoun of she?
Well, I don't really think God is gendered. Yeah. I think of God more as a presence and less as a person.
Mm.
But I think when we use the pronoun she or they for God, I think it shakes us up out of tired thinking. And I'm always a fan of shaking ourselves up out of tired thinking. I think it's important to ask questions and to wonder, is this really serving us? Is there a better way to think about this? Is there a bigger way to think about this? Is there a more accurate and fair and true and kind way to think about all of it? And then I'm in.
Yeah. Well, I love that personally, because I think, just my own experience, I found it always difficult to trust in a God that was a man, actually. Experience. And then when I very first heard Pachamama, this feminine kind of God, and that really resonated for me. So I really liked the way that you have shaken us up with that little pronoun, Charlotte.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, that's great. And also that this book, really, it's a love story, isn't it? And it's a love story for the great love that you have for Sam, and that you then meet Tim, and how sort of amazing to have met him, who was also a widow. And this is where the story sort of, lands. And I wanted to, welcome Tim into this conversation as well, because he's a big part of your story and your book. So I don't know if you want to say anything about Tim.
We laugh over here. We've been calling Tim page 179 because that's where he comes into the book. I did not expect to fall in love again. That was not where I was. Right after Sam died, I actually it didn't really occur to me that I was single until one of the kids brought it up. He said, Mommy, you have to get married again because I need a stepdaddy because I'm too little to be the man of the house. Yeah. So we had a lot of conversations about the man of the house. I said, sweetheart, you're the 8-year-old of the house. Your job is baseball and play dates and 3rd grade. That's your job. And I'll take care of the rest. So I wasn't thinking about getting married again, but it was really important to me that my kids open their hearts. And so one of the things we talked about is there's a daddy-shaped space in your heart that will be there forever. And nobody takes over that place. Nobody else fits in that space. But the thing about love is that your heart can grow. And if somebody special comes into our life, this is what I told my kids, if somebody special comes into our life, then our hearts will grow and there will be a new space for him. It doesn't take over the daddy space. He doesn't fit into the daddy space. It's his own space because love grows. That's just love's nature. When I said that to the kids, I had no intention of falling in love again. I had been married once. I had been loved for who I was. I was grateful. And honestly, I was busy. I had 2 little kids. I didn't really want stubble in the sink or upended toilet seats. Like I was done. I was good. I could take care of myself. I could take care of my kids. And then I accidentally fell in love with the most eligible widower in town, and who also had 2 kids. It was really important to me, though, that when I wrote the book, it didn't end with Tim's and my wedding, like sort of like, okay, they're fixed now. Charlotte's fixed, Tim's fixed, everybody's fixed, and we don't have to worry about that nasty little grief business anymore, because that's not reality. So we did get married, and we do have a beautiful family. And we have 4 children who have lost a parent. And we have supported all of them in their grief. And we are very proud of how they are moving forward in their lives. But it's not like tied up with a pretty bow. Grief doesn't really end. And I am really happy.
Yeah.
I'm in love. Tim and I have been married now for 12 years. We have this beautiful family. We have now 2 daughters in love and a granddaughter. So our life is so full and beautiful and blessed. And now, a book baby. I'm very happy in my life. And one of the things that we hold both end is I would never have thrown Sam under the bus. And yet I am very happy in this life. And learning to hold both of those things is part of our path, part of my path. And so, yes, I do talk a lot about that in the book, because I think that's what healing really means, is finding a way to hold on to both without holding on too tightly.
Well, you may have already answered my last question, really, but and I always like to ask people at the end, would your interpretation be of the term conscious grief?
Something people say a lot is time heals all wounds. I completely disagree. I think that is unconscious grief. Time passing doesn't heal anything. I think what time does is it gives us the opportunity to do the work. And so for me, conscious grief would be doing the work. And it starts with self-care. Are you eating? Are you sleeping? Are you breathing? Start there. And then we'll keep working. Yeah. Until we reach this place where we can hold both our grief with tenderness and the life that is ours to live with enthusiastic open arms.
Beautiful. Thank you, Charlotte. So much wisdom, and I just love everything that you shared. Thank you. And before we say goodbye, I know that you have got 5 books to give away, signed copies of Sushi Tuesdays. So what we're going to do is put a link on under this for people to sign up with your name and email, and then we'll pick the first, or pick a random 5 and get those sent out to you. So don't miss out on that. And we'll also have a link to the book anyways on here, so people can go straight to it and purchase it. And I really, I don't think I've ever read a book so fast in all my life. Like, the pace is fantastic, everything about it. So really highly recommend it to everybody.
Thank you, Tom. I'm just really grateful for this opportunity. Thanks so much for including me. And I really am so grateful for the work that you do. I just think it's so important that we are conscious about our grief.
Oh, thank you, Charlotte. And thank you so much to everybody who's been listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And I do hope you enjoy the book.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.